So hi, everyone. I'm really happy to see so many familiar faces. It's really nice to see all of you. So welcome to this week's Inequality and Social Policy Seminar. My name is Maya Sen. I'm a professor of public policy here at the Kennedy School, and I'm also the director of the Inequality and Social Policy program. Just a few notes about this weekly speaker series. So the series is made possible by the James M. and Catherine D. Stone PhD Scholars Program, of which many of you are affiliates in the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy here at the Kennedy School. And to actually introduce Julia, I'm going to turn it over to Hunter Rendelman, who's one of our fellows in the Inequality and Social Policy program.
Thanks, Maya. So as Maya said, my name is Hunter Rendelman. I'm a third-year PhD candidate in government. And today I'm super delighted to welcome Julia Payson, someone who's a big inspiration for my own research, and someone whose work I think is at the forefront of federalism and subnational politics research. Julia is going to be speaking from her second book project today, which is joint work with Maria Carreri at UC San Diego. And it's going to examine how the managerial practices used by mayors and city managers shape governance outcomes at the local level. Julia is an assistant professor in the Department of Politics at NYU. She's a fellow this academic year at the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics at Princeton University. Her research interests include elections, representation, accountability, and public service provision in state and local governments in the United States. Her first book, which is really good, and you should read it, When Cities Lobby, explores how cities seek to shape state politics through lobbying and documents the effects of this behavior on municipal inequality. This book is based on her dissertation, which won the American Political Science Association's Best Dissertation Award in State Politics and Policy in 2018. She received her PhD in political science from Stanford University in 2017, where she was an affiliated researcher at the Bill Lane Center for the American West. So super excited to hear from you, Julia. Super excited for this talk, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Hunter, for that nice introduction. As Hunter mentioned, the work I'm presenting today is joint with Maria Carreri, who's at UCSD in the Policy School, and we're really looking forward to your questions and feedback. So many of you are probably familiar with Pete Buttigieg, who ran an unsuccessful campaign to be the Democratic nominee for president last year, and more recently has been appointed to serve as Secretary of Transportation in the Biden administration. But before rising to national prominence, Buttigieg made local headlines when he was elected as mayor of South Bend, Indiana. And he won this election on a very technocratic platform where he emphasized his credentials as a former Harvard grad and McKinsey consultant. And he claimed that his experience in the private sector would help him generate jobs and revitalize the city's economy. By some accounts, Mayor Pete was pretty successful at achieving these goals. So during his time in office, South Bend secured millions of dollars in new investments for tech and infrastructure, and unemployment decreased relative to statewide averages. But among residents of color, who make up nearly half of South Bend's population, reviews of Pete's legacy are much more mixed, with a lot of people pointing out that he didn't noticeably reduce homelessness or poverty rates. And in fact, the city became even more segregated between white and Black residents during his time in office. So in this paper, we ask what happens when cities elect technocratic leaders like Pete Buttigieg to govern them. Historically, we have reason to believe that the dynamics that played out in South Bend are not unique. So going back to the progressive era in the early 20th century, reformers have perennially advocated for city governments to be run more like a business. And the idea was that a more professional technocratic approach to city governance would help to clean up machine-style corruption, generate growth, and make cities more attractive to businesses and middle-class residents. But what ended up happening was that the reform-oriented city officials that started coming into power during this time tended to pursue economic development at the expense of engaging in more progressive programs to help the poorer residents of their cities. So these reform era technocrats often focused on growing the tax base and catering to business and middle class interests by doing things like investing in central business districts or developing wealthy neighborhoods rather than building public housing or trying to improve infrastructure or welfare provision in poor and minority communities. In influential literature in urban political economy would later emerge that argues that this type of pattern is basically inevitable. So typically, the argument goes that cities are constrained by the fact that they can't control labor and capital flows across their boundaries. So if city leaders try to raise taxes or engage in progressive redistribution, businesses and wealthy residents will simply leave to neighboring jurisdictions. And HKS's own Paul Peterson famously articulated a version of this argument in his book, City Limits, writing, "The pursuit of a city's economic interests, which requires an efficient provision of local services, makes no allowances for the care of the needy and unfortunate members of the society." So we have theoretical reasons to believe that most city officials should want to pursue economic growth and might have trouble engaging in redistributive policies. And we have historical accounts that suggest that the type of city leader who is most likely to behave according to the predictions of these urban growth models are these technocratic candidates like Pete Buttigieg. The goal of this paper is really to examine whether technocratic leaders are indeed more likely or more able to pursue economic development, as suggested by both theory and historical evidence, and if so, at what cost? So to answer this question, we designed an original survey adapted from the econ literature that allows us to measure the managerial styles of local government officials in the US and to quantify the extent to which they use the best practices of organizational performance, which was one of the goals of the technocratic municipal reform movement. We then linked the results of our survey to city expenditures and other financial and demographic outcomes to see what happens after leaders who score more or less highly on this dimension take office. And in particular, we adopt a widely used typology from the urban politics and policy analysis literature that classifies expenditures into three broad policy areas that are generally referred to as developmental, redistributive, and allocational policies. So according to this typology, developmental policies are defined as those that promote a city's growth or economic prosperity. And examples include things like outlays for highways or airports, or developing downtown business districts, or building convention centers. Redistributive policies, on the other hand, are those that tend to disproportionately benefit lower income residents and generally include spending on areas like public health, welfare, and public housing. And finally, allocational policies are basic city services and housekeeping type activities that benefit all residents, but that don't primarily seek to promote growth. So spending on things like police and fire protection, sanitation services, or just paying the salaries of municipal staff. And of course, this classification scheme isn't perfect, and I'll show you all the results broken down by the individual expenditure items that make up these categories. But adopting this typology is sort of the most direct way that we can speak to and test some of these predictions generated by these classic growth machine models of urban politics. To preview the results, we're going to use a difference in differences type setup that I'll explain in detail, where we examine outcomes in the same cities over time. And we find that when technocratic city leaders take office, they are indeed more likely to increase spending on developmental policies and to cut spending on redistributive programs relative to other leaders. And we also uncover evidence that this shift in policy priorities seems to be associated with faster than average growth as measured by city population, property tax revenues, and median housing values. And I'll talk about why we chose these measures when we get into the results. Together, these findings speak to classic debates in the urban politics literature about the conditions under which cities pursue a growth agenda and suggest that this type of approach can have real trade-offs and might not benefit everyone equally, especially those residents that rely more on redistributive programs and services. So I don't mind if you interrupt me during the talk for clarifying questions, but I'll just ask that you use the raise hand function because it's a little difficult for me to monitor the chat, but feel free to post your substantive questions in the chat and we can get to those at the end. To carry out this research, we identified 9 states to serve as our sampling frame, and we decided to focus on cities with at least 5,000 residents. And we selected these 9 states because they each had a fairly large number of municipalities with available budget data. And we also wanted to maximize diversity in terms of geography and also form of government at the local level. So in the US, there are 2 primary forms of municipal government, mayor council systems and council manager systems. And the key difference is in who holds executive power and can steer city policy priorities. So in mayor council systems, mayors are elected as heads of their city councils, and they have substantial budgetary and administrative authority. In council manager systems, the city council appoints a full-time city manager to serve as the government's chief administrator, and that's the person who typically develops the budget. And originally, we wanted to include both types of cities in our study to make the results as generalizable as possible, and also because we thought there might be interesting variation across these elected versus appointed offices. But in the end, we end up pooling the results across these 2 types of cities and controlling for form of government, in part because we weren't able to conduct enough interviews to effectively split up the data. And also the effects ended up looking really similar across both types of leaders. We conducted all of our interviews between October 2018 and August 2019. And we invited whoever the city leader was in 2016 to participate because we wanted to make sure we have enough years of outcome data after that person took office to be able to compare outcomes to the pre-period. After conducting an interview, we also always tried to contact the interviewee's predecessor and to interview them as well so that we could obtain within city measures of managerial skill. And we were successfully able to do this for 25 cities, which will be an important part of our empirical strategy to validate some of the assumptions necessary for doing this within city design. So to measure the managerial skill of our respondents, we adopt survey methodology developed by Bloom and Van Reenen, who are both economists and who wrote this widely cited paper from 2007, where they identified 4 types of managerial practices that are the most important for predicting corporate performance. And this approach has also been successfully replicated in a variety of other private and public settings, meaning that leaders who use these best practices tend to produce systematically different types of organizational results. And key for our purposes, these practices really capture the spirit of the technocratic municipal reform movement, which emphasized managerial efficiency in city governance. So the 4 practices are target setting, performance monitoring, operations, and incentives. Target setting is basically about setting goals. So how well defined are a manager's goals? Is there an associated time frame? How are these goals communicated to different members of the staff? Performance monitoring is about how leaders track whether their organization is actually on target to achieve its goals. So are there indicators that are being used to track progress? How often does this happen, etc. Operations reflects how well a manager understands the day-to-day mechanics of their organization. So do they know how their firm actually operates? And finally, incentives is about how managers deal with staff, and in particular, how do they reward staff members that are doing well or address issues of poor performance. The basic idea is that we ask open-ended questions related to these 4 types of technocratic management practices, and we score the respondents' answer in real time based on a detailed rubric with scores ranging from a low of 1 to a high of 5. So by way of example, here is the scoring rubric for 1 question and some anonymized sample answers that earn scores of 1, 3, and 5, respectively. This question was designed to assess target setting, and low scores were assigned when the interviewee had very vague or loosely defined goals with no practical targets associated with them, no real efforts at communicating these goals to other members of the city council or staff. So in this example, one respondent said they wanted to develop the downtown, but when probed further, they didn't really have any clear sense of steps or a timeline. At the other end of the spectrum, we assigned scores of 5 when the goals were clearly defined with specific steps along the way and some indication that other members of the government are aware of these goals and engaged with achieving them. So one respondent who earned a 5 was able to articulate 3 very clear goals related to promoting economic development in the downtown district and told us exactly who was responsible for monitoring progress on these goals. So the scores for each individual question are based on these rubrics, and we then create an overall managerial score, which is the unweighted average of the scores of each individual question. We then have a second research assistant independently listen to and score a recorded version of each interview. And the score we use in our analysis is the average overall score assigned by both interviewers. We also demonstrate that the results are robust to using an inverse covariance weighted score to make sure that no specific question is driving the overall results. And we also get the same results if we drop any one of the 4 practices when calculating the average score. Finally, the interviewers also ask questions about the leader's age, race, education, previous occupation, experience in local government, and ideology, which we include as control variables to adjust for individual characteristics that might be correlated with a leader's managerial score while also affecting their spending priorities. So there are obviously some potential issues with this setup that could lead to either interviewer or interviewee bias. In the interest of time, I'll just assert that this approach has been used and validated by other researchers in a bunch of different contexts, and we use all of the best practices established by this literature. I'm more than happy during the Q&A to come back and talk a bit more about the methodology if there are questions. So ultimately, we were able to secure interviews with mayors and city managers from 286 cities, including 25 former leaders, which yielded 311 total interviews, and we had a response rate of just over 30%. And this is the distribution of the managerial scores. So the scores range from a low of 1.6 to a high of 5 with quite a bit of variation. And higher scores indicate higher levels of managerial expertise, which is our proxy for technocratic leadership styles. And the average score is 3.68. As an initial validity check, we wanted to look at which personal characteristics of the leader are associated with higher or lower scores. So this table is just showing the correlates of the score based on OLS regressions. And you can see in the first row that age is negatively correlated with our measure of managerial expertise. So older folks tended to score less highly on this dimension, whereas having a college degree or especially an advanced degree has a positive association. Interestingly, we don't find any correlation with the managerial score in either the number of years the leader has served in local government or with having a previous job in business. We think the fact that there's no correlation with the number of years serving in that position sort of indicates that this managerial score is a fixed trait. It's not something that people are learning over time or getting better at over time, but rather it seems to be just something that candidates enter office already sort of having a sense of the way they want to govern. And then this finding that there's no correlation with a business background, there is some recent research showing that mayors who come into office with a business background, they do tend to run government for business and they tend to be very business friendly, but they're not necessarily expert managers. And in fact, having a background in business does not necessarily mean you were in management. So we kind of believe that correlation. And then with ideology, we also, we were maybe expecting there to be a correlation between being more right-leaning and having a more technocratic approach. But I mean, Pete Buttigieg is a perfect example of a Democratic candidate who is also very technocratic, and at the local level, partisanship often just operates a bit differently. So in all of our analyses, we'll show results both with and without these covariates. And of course, it would be impossible to adjust for every characteristic of local leaders that might correlate both with our score and with outcomes. But we think this battery of control variables can help rule out some of the more obvious stories. So it's not the case that our analysis is picking up primarily the effect of a leader being younger or being more right-leaning, for example. And even though the leaders in our sample who have high managerial scores might be different in other unobservable ways, At some point, these differences likely load onto the very dimension of technocratic leadership that we are trying to capture. We also examined the city level correlates of the managerial score, and we find that city size is the variable that most consistently predicts where high scoring leaders emerge. And this makes sense if we think that larger cities are maybe more complex to govern or have larger staffs and more service responsibilities. So to account for this, in the main analyses, we'll always bin cities by size and include population fixed effects. And in certain specifications, we also control for each of these other city characteristics. But even though we don't actually see a whole lot of observable differences between the places that select high versus low scoring leaders, you're probably thinking that it's still very likely that unobservable city characteristics might be determining which types of cities are selecting technocratic leaders, while also being the types of places that might attract growth regardless of which leader takes office. So to address this, we leverage a within city design where we examine how outcomes change in cities that elect or appoint high scoring leaders relative to cities that elect or appoint lower scoring leaders. We're calling this a modified difference in differences because we only observe the managerial score after the leaders in our sample take office, but we observe city outcomes both before and after. And I'll talk about the assumptions necessary to interpret the results causally in a few slides. So we are predicting outcomes in city I in normalized year T, calendar year J. The T is going to index the number of years since the interviewed leader took office, with T equals 0 being the first year. The alpha I's are city fixed effects. Beta T's are normalized year fixed effects, which control for political budget cycles. The gamma J's are calendar year fixed effects to control for year specific shocks. And the coefficient that we care about is delta, which captures the differential changes in cities that select leaders with different values of the managerial score before and after the leader takes office. We also have a bunch of time invariant control variables, the XKIs, which we interact with the post indicator to be able to include in the regressions. And these always include fixed effects for city population quintile, interviewer, and form of government. And then we build up the models to also include the individual leader characteristics that I showed you, like gender and age, and also city characteristics like median income and percent white. And we generally prefer to fix these city level variables at their value in the first year of the sample to make sure that they're not measured post-treatment. But in some specifications, we also allow these covariates to enter the regressions in a time varying way, which if anything makes the results stronger. And of course, we'll always cluster the standard errors at the city level. So there are two important identifying assumptions to this approach. The first is the standard parallel trends assumption, which we can examine with sort of the typical event study where we look at pre-treatment trends in the data. And the additional assumption that we need is that the managerial score of a mayor or manager not be correlated with the score of the predecessor. And again, this is because we're only observing the managerial score after our interviewed leader takes office, which means we're picking up the effect both of the previous leader leaving and the current leader taking office. And the most problematic case would be a strong negative correlation. So say someone who scores very low on this managerial competence dimension is replaced by someone who scores very high. This might bias the estimates away from 0, although the size of the bias can be bounded with a worst case scenario of coefficients being twice as large if it's a perfect -1 correlation. If instead there were a positive correlation, this would generally bias our estimates towards 0 and make it more difficult to detect an effect. But fortunately, we find actually no correlation between the management scores of current and former officials. So recall, we were able to conduct 50 interviews with leaders from 25 cities where we spoke to both the current and the former leader. And it's not a huge number of interviews, but it was enough to pick up some interesting correlations. For example, places that elect a woman in one period are more likely to elect another woman in the subsequent period. Same thing goes for years of education or for ideology. So it's not the case that we don't have enough interviews to pick up any correlations, but it does seem like there is no systematic correlation in this managerial score dimension of current and former leaders. All right, so here are the main results. A lot going on in this table, so I'm going to break it all down. The overall idea is that we're looking at within city changes in expenditures for redistributive in the first 3 columns and developmental in the last 3 columns policies after the leaders in our sample take office. I'm just omitting allocational policies from here because the theoretical predictions are much less clear and to save space. And remember, we're using this Lowy-Peterson typology to define these policy areas. And on the next slide, I'll show you the breakdown of each individual spending category that goes within each of these 2 broad areas. And our main theoretical prediction is that technocratic leaders will govern their cities according to these growth machine models of urban politics and will prioritize economic growth rather than redistribution. And consistent with this theory, we do find that when leaders take office with higher managerial scores, they reduce spending on redistributive programs and increase spending on developmental programs. So the top half of the table is showing the change to just total spending in these policy areas in thousands of dollars logged. The bottom half of the table examines the share of the budget allocated to each category, so between 0 and 1. Columns 1 and 4 are showing the baseline models, which just have the city, the year, the interview, the form of government, and the population quintile fixed effects. In columns 2 and 5, we're adding those leader controls like race and gender and years of experience in local government. And then in columns 3 and 6, we're adding our city level controls. So looking at total spending in the top panel, the substantive interpretation is that redistributive spending decreases by about 37 to 40% for each standard deviation increase in the managerial score. The development spending increases a bit more modestly by around 5%, and obviously this effect is a bit noisier here. But keep in mind that cities are spending a lot more on development policies than redistributive ones. So most cities in our sample are spending over 30 million a year on development projects and only 4 million on redistributive spending. Or another way to think about this is that development-related spending comprises around 30% of the budget, while redistributive spending is only 2%. And when we examine the share of the budget going to each category, we get a more precisely estimated positive effect of the managerial score on development spending, with this type of expenditure comprising around 2% more of the budget in the post period. So now we're going to disaggregate those 2 broad categories that I just showed you into their component parts to see which types of spending are driving the results. And it seems like the decrease in funding for redistributive policies is coming primarily from lower investment in public health, which is particularly interesting in light of the pandemic that we are now facing. So public health expenditures fund things like community healthcare, public health education, visiting nurses, immunization programs, and outpatient health clinics. And in many ways, this spending is largely discretionary for cities because counties are typically the level of local government that's most involved with public health. So even though a 30% reduction might seem huge, it's actually pretty typical for these small and mid-sized cities to do things like offer a free flu clinic in one year, but not another, or to hire or fire an additional visiting nurse working for the city. So we actually think that this is a real and substantive decrease that is, presumably a way to try to save money, cut down on costs. Turning to developmental expenditures, you'll see that most of the categories are positive but pretty noisy, with the exception of community development. And this is an interesting category because it often includes spending that could be considered redistributive in nature. So in the Census of Governments, which is the source of the finance data that we're using, the community development category includes spending on both public and private development projects. So policies to revitalize commercial areas might be developmental in nature, whereas rent subsidies or building public housing might be redistributive. And if we reclassify community development as a redistributive policy, our results look even better. but we keep the category sort of the way it is just to be consistent with existing literature that typically uses this typology scheme. You can see that most of the action with the increase in development spending is actually coming from this public buildings category. And we dug into this a bit, and really what's happening here it's these mixed use public-private partnership type buildings where the city is joining up with private investors and developers to create these mixed use spaces where, there's a giant office complex, but the city is investing some of the money and gets access for certain public services and areas. It doesn't include building things like schools or police departments. Those are classified elsewhere. It's really sort of these public-private partnerships, and we think that's sort of exactly the type of thing that a technocratic leader would be probably more likely to invest in. So next, we examine whether the parallel trends assumption seems plausible by looking at outcomes in cities before the leaders with higher or lower scores take office. There don't appear to be any concerning pre-trends, and this analysis helps to rule out perhaps the most plausible alternative story, which is that trending changes in economic or demographic conditions are ultimately responsible both for the selection of a technocratic leader and also for any associated change in spending priorities. So imagine a city that is attracting more affluent residents over time. That city might shift demand towards less redistributive spending, while also increasing the likelihood that a managerially skilled leader is elected. But if that were the case, we think we would expect to observe the change in expenditures kicking in more gradually prior to the selection of the leader in our sample, and that's not what we see. And finally, we turn to the question of whether these expenditure choices actually matter for city growth. And we use 3 related outcomes to measure this: property tax revenues, city population, and median home values. Property tax revenues are just the amount of revenue raised from property taxes. And we think that this reflects increasing property values on the one hand, or if local leaders are able to actually increase the cap on the property tax rate, that also shows that the city is doing well economically, because that's a very risky proposition, and you would only do it if you thought you could get away with it politically. So yeah, it either reflects increased property values or just a very favorable political environment. Population is sort of a very simple way to get at this idea of whether a city is shrinking or growing. A lot of times the popular media will use population trends as a very simple proxy for if a place is thriving or not. And then median home values, these are interesting because it's self-reported from the American Community Survey. But even if people are self-reporting their home values, if they think their home values are going up, we again think this is kind of a proxy for growth. Most homeowners are pretty aware of what property values are doing. It's the largest asset for most families. These are all sort of rough proxies for the idea of economic growth, but we find it encouraging that all of the results are consistently positive, suggesting that the choices of the higher scoring, more technocratic leaders in our sample are generating growth across a variety of indicators. We perform a bunch of robustness checks that I'm happy to talk about more during the Q&A, but in the interest of maximizing time for questions, I think I'll go ahead and wrap up. In this paper, we asked, how do city policy priorities change when technocratic leaders take office, and who benefits? And one of the contributions of this research is that we provide a new way to measure the managerial expertise of local leaders and a method to test predictions from classic urban political economy literature about the relationship between managerial efficiency, growth, and redistribution. And we find some of the most systematic evidence to date that technocratic leaders do seem more likely to pursue economic development, but they also decrease spending on redistributive programs, and especially public health. And together, these results help contribute to the ongoing debate about whether and how city leaders matter for local outcomes. And they also highlight the fact that a technocratic approach to city governance may not translate into unambiguously positive outcomes for all residents. So thank you so much. It was really nice to be able to get through the whole talk and have plenty of time for Q&A. So I'll go ahead and open up the chat box here.
Julie, I'm happy to direct traffic around the Q&A or let you take questions as you'd like.
So I'll start by just answering all the questions that are in the chat, and then I can actually see folks raising their hands. I see Hunter's hand. So yeah, if I need you to help MC, I will, but I'll just take a stab at it for now. So I'll start with Tamar's question. Can you speak to the gender finding in the managerial score? So yeah, we just didn't find a correlation between gender and the score. We thought maybe women would score more highly, but we just didn't. There were not that many women in our sample, so it could be that, but it could also just be that gender is not a salient dimension for the score. Is the N 25? No, that's for, the N is 25 for the cities for which we have both the predecessor and the current mayor or manager. So we always tried to interview both the person in office in 2016 and then the person in office before that, because we wanted to be able to have these within city measures. The N is 286, except for the analysis where we're comparing predecessors and successors. How is public health usually funded at the local level? So this is a great question. It's usually funded by the county and by the state. Any spending that the cities are allocating towards public health are often coming from other levels of government. One thing that we considered was perhaps if these local city officials are cutting public health spending, maybe they're successfully able to outsource those services to another level of government, like the county. So as sort of a supplementary analysis, we look at county expenditures towards public health in places in the cities that select higher or lower scoring leaders. And we actually don't find that counties are substituting. So in the cities that select the higher scoring leaders that cut the public health spending, the counties are also spending less. It is not the case that they're sort of just efficiently outsourcing these policies to another level of government, but that's a really great question. Can a leader with a redistributive agenda also be technocratic? E.g. an economist steeped in inequality data gets to the clearness of definition. Yeah, so I think as you point out, we are a little fast and loose with what we mean by technocratic. Clearly our measure speaks to one very particular dimension, which is managerial expertise and how you score on these 4 dimensions that we were asking about. We do think that these types of people are more likely to use data and sort of have a quantitative approach to city governance. But we think that sort of ties into this idea that you want to tackle things that are easily quantifiable, and you want to have goals that are things that you can actually track progress towards, such as economic development. You know, social justice goals are often a lot more nebulous and a lot more difficult to sort of track in the same way. So yeah, I do want to be careful about, expanding, not expanding the definition of technocratic leadership to be all encompassing. You know, if it helps, we can just think about this one particular dimension, which is managerial expertise. But we do think it's very consistent with this idea that there's a certain type of local leader who's going to have a taste for this type of growth-oriented agenda, and also be willing and able to move city policy in that direction. And even though we have lots of anecdotal evidence that it's like the Pete Buttigieg's of the world who behave this way, we've never actually been able to sort of systematically quantify this and show how this operates across multiple cities. So in the participants menu, I know Hunter had her hand up.
Yeah, you answered part of my question when you responded to my question on funding. But yeah, I guess given your other research on cities as lobbyists, I'm curious if you looked more broadly across different forms of policy to see if there is like this sort of like efficient sort of moving up or like bumping up of different policies to county, state, federal level. Like, do you see people like pursuing more grants? Do you see people sending out more lobbyists when they have like these more technocratic leaders?
Yeah, so we did try looking at whether these more technocratic or high scoring leaders lobby disproportionately. So yes, my other work is on cities using lobbyists to secure funding from the state government. And we actually didn't find that these places were more likely to hire lobbyists, or that these leaders were more likely. And I was pretty surprised by that, because I sort of had in mind as that being the exact type of goal that a leader who scored highly on this managerial competence dimension might want to pursue. One of the issues is the cities in our sample are quite small, and a lot of these smaller and more mid-sized cities just don't lobby at as high of rates as larger cities. So it might just be we're sort of below the threshold where that type of behavior is the most salient thing they can be doing. But we did also look at state and federal grant transfers to these cities after the leaders took office, and we didn't find anything. And again, we were surprised by this, because you would think that if these folks are so, managerially skilled and efficient, that they would be finding ways to sort of just creatively generate more revenue. But again, we didn't find anything there either. We're not sure whether that reflects sort of constraints of the types of cities that elect these leaders. So a lot of these grants are sort of formula based, and certain cities just aren't going to be eligible. But I do think an interesting future direction for this research would be to expand the range of outcomes that we're looking at. We wanted to do sort of the Peterson-Lowy typology just because so much literature has looked at it. So it sort of is a good first step. But I think you're absolutely right that, sort of getting creative about thinking about what other strategies are these folks employing would be a really great next step. Thanks.
Just like one off the top of my head, because I guess that you are dealing with very small cities, or like municipal or like local sharing agreements, like to share resources between cities.
Yes.
I know my small town entered into a lot of those sorts of agreements with a very technocratic type of mayor. So that'd be really interesting.
And that would be sort of exactly the same type of logic as these public-private partnerships, which was the strongest things we're finding. So that's a great suggestion. Thank you. Subik?
Hi, Julia. Shobik. Big fan of your project and your other work. Apologies if you mentioned this, but I wonder if like political ambition for higher office sort of plays a big role in associates or predicts manager style. I can imagine like ambitions for higher office maybe predicts pursuit of like these like maybe bigger, perhaps sexier redistributive projects that get more media coverage, or maybe the other way around. It just being more results oriented is what sort of attracts attention from donors or from the media. But yeah, I was wondering, if political ambition was sort of part of the story here.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And as you say, I think it's sort of an empirically open question where it actually could go in either direction. We did ask a question about managerial ambition and whether the mayors in our sample were planning to run for higher office. And we actually didn't find a correlation between ambition and wanting to run for higher office. And we weren't quite sure what to make about that. Because you would think that these folks who score highly on this dimension might be, particularly likely to have their eyes set on achieving office and in higher levels of government. But it's also the case that a lot of the folks who scored highly tended to serve in larger cities. And I think some of these people, they have careers in local government, especially city managers, that is their career. They go from city to city, but it's not like they're running for office and going to higher levels of government. I didn't mention it just because we're a little puzzled by this lack of correlation, but I think that's an interesting point that you made, that maybe the folks who want to run for higher office, they're more focused on the symbolic, interesting, splashy social justice things rather than these more sort of nitpicky, managerially oriented smaller goals. So yeah, I think we would need to go back to the data and sort of dig in and sort of look at the profiles of the high versus low scoring people. But I think it's a great suggestion. Thanks. Let's see, I'll go back to the chat here.
Julia, we actually have a question in the chat from Mo Torres. Mo, I don't know if you just want to ask your question or expand on it, because I saw you in there somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was just wondering if you have any insights from your interviews on like the leaders you identify and maybe the quality of local democracy. And I've been thinking a lot about Wendy Brown's argument that when there is neoliberalism and technocratic logics, that collective decision making and deliberative democracy are sort of eroded. And I was wondering if that could be kind of connected to the economic priorities you observe, like if there's more kind of voice in the process or less, would that lead to maybe the outcomes that you've identified?
Yeah, so I think that's completely sort of consistent with what we're observing, this idea that the people who score highly on this particular dimension of this managerial expertise, it does not necessarily mean that they are better leaders in any sense. It doesn't mean that they're better at engaging stakeholders or better at building consensus. And in fact, yes, based on Brown's work and others, I think it can almost be easier to erase some of those participatory impulses and just focus on the data, focus on the quantifiable indicators, just work to hit your job numbers, get your development numbers. So my sense is that your intuition is correct, and that the folks who score highly on this dimension, they do sort of subscribe to this neoliberal ethos of wanting to rationalize local government. And this was back in the progressive era, the folks who took office during this time to clean up machine politics, they also dramatically disenfranchised poor and immigrant communities, and participation went dramatically down in these cities. So I think there's sort of an interesting through thread that goes through a lot of this research and historiography. So I agree with your interpretation. I think it's very consistent. And then let's see, I see Jed and Carl in the chat. I'm just gonna go up to the top and go in reverse order. Have you looked at the granting of corporate local tax break effects on degrees of economic real growth, effects on wage levels in the lower income deciles? So I do think, yes, this idea of looking at the effect of these choices on income, both inequality and real growth, would be very interesting. I guess we would have to use American Community Survey data, and those estimates, they're usually 3 or 5 year estimates for sort of the smaller cities that are in our sample, but we could absolutely do that because it would be interesting if inequality were increasing, or it would also be interesting if growth did trickle down. We would reach very different conclusions about how normatively either troubling or appropriate this behavior was if, the wages of the lower income brackets were actually going up. So we haven't yet done that, but I could easily imagine us getting American Community Survey data and looking at that. It's interesting. We were thinking of income as being sort of a control variable and something that might condition the types of places where these leaders emerge, but we can absolutely look before and after. I think that's a good suggestion. And then Carl said, could one compare leaders with redistributed records with leaders with growth records to ferret out leadership styles? So thinking about the types of platforms that folks ran on, or looking at their previous experience, and then trying to figure out, are there other salient dimensions that divide them? One interesting thing that I'll point out is that when we ask city leaders, what are the most important issues facing your city? What are your goals for your time in office? A big majority, almost 60%, do mention some sort of goal related to either growth or economic development, but those goal mentions are not correlated with the managerial score. So everyone sort of claims that they want, to revitalize the economy of their communities, but certain people just seem much more willing to shift or able to shift policy in that direction in a way, where the rubber meets the road. So we haven't actually thought about looking at the backgrounds or sort of campaign promises or styles of these different types of leaders, but that would be really interesting to just go and look, like, what type of platform did these folks run on? What were their priors and credentials? And do we see systematic differences? I actually really like that idea. Mo, I believe we just spoke. That's great. Jed said, have you found a relationship between managerial expertise and social empathy? So my prior would be there would be a negative correlation, but we actually didn't. Oh, actually, okay. So we didn't ask about social empathy per se We did ask the standard sort of Perry Public Service motivation index questions of the folks in our sample. So that kind of asks how much are the leaders driven by pursuing the public good and sort of serving the public rather than pursuing lucrative private sector goals. And we do find a negative relationship between Perry Public Service motivation and our managerial expertise score. So I think that's the closest thing I can say that would speak to social empathy. I think if we, so this is obviously one set of interviews that we've conducted so far. We've applied for grants to expand this data collection because obviously the sample's a bit small, and if we want to write a book, we would like to have many more. So I think the next time we do this, that would be really interesting to try to include some additional dimensions of things like social empathy or belief in local participatory democracy or sort of ability to engage the community and think about what are the trade-offs that either go along with or not with these scores. I think that's great. Carla says, I was thinking about their actual performance. Well, so a lot of these folks haven't actually served in prior office before. The city managers certainly have. So the city managers often had already worked in some cities, but a lot of the mayors, especially in the small and mid-sized places, this was sort of their first time to elected office. Especially, someone like Pete Buttigieg, this is their stepping stone to higher office. Although it is a little weird that we didn't find the correlation between future ambition and the score. But, certainly for the folks who did serve before, we can try to look. So you would measure after X number of years in office. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something to think about. We want to avoid telling an individual story about each person in our sample, but I think just trying to sort of roughly identify some of the more high scoring and some of the less high scoring leaders and looking at their background and past experience and performance, I think it's a great point. So that's helpful. Jed, or let's see, maybe Kirsten and then Jed.
Hi, yeah. Thank you so much for coming there and present today. I'm a big fan of your work and it was really exciting to see this project.
Thanks.
I think it's really interesting how you're rooting this work in kind of historical trends towards technocracy. And I guess I wonder whether perceptions of technocratic leadership or what it means to be technocratic have changed over time, especially as cities have become more responsible for redistribution, as there's been kind of a decentralization of these responsibilities from the federal level.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question because I do think that there's often a sense that, if cities want to be effective and if they want to be run well, then they should be relying on data. And there's been this whole, movement towards transparent cities and trying to sort of use technology and get with the 21st century to be effective, given that cities are the level of government who are, taking care of police brutality and like dealing with the public health crisis and dealing with like the housing crisis, all these redistributive policies that are really salient are important for cities. So this idea that maybe the way that we think about the desirability of technocracy in city leaders has changed over time is a really interesting one. I hadn't given too much thought to the idea that this definition might have changed over time. If anything, my intuition is that there's a sense that this type of managerial expertise is really just a neutrally good thing. Like, how could it not be good to be able to set clear goals and have timelines and have indicators and be able to use data? I think a lot of social scientists and sort of a particular type of liberal or neoliberal leader sort of has in mind that this is just an unambiguously good thing. But I do think we have to think about, what sort of people what other characteristics accompany this emphasis. So, we talked about social empathy and participatory democracy. And this is, I'm just speculating here at this point. My sense is the danger lies in this perception that these managerial expertise is just neutral, value neutral. I think we need to examine that assumption. And I think this research sort of sheds light on that. I think it's a really great question. And, I wish I had more for you now, but in the book, I think we will definitely want to think about that. So thank you. Maya says, any last questions from a student? I also see Jed's hand still up. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Julia, I actually have a question.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about and I think this relates to the discussion you had with Mo. Could you talk a little bit more about the interplay between technocratic sensibilities and ideology and partisanship? Because I know you account for that in your analysis and you think through that really well. But in my mind, I just keep going back to this, they just seem more moderate. And I know that you account for that, but I was just hoping you could talk through a little bit about why I should not be concerned about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point, because it might be the case that these folks are sort of not ideologues. And so rather than running on a traditional partisan platform and sort of trying to pursue the goals associated with particular parties, yes, maybe they are just these sort of neutral experts who are really good at organizational efficiency. And their goal is to just, check those boxes, get that growth. So our prior was that there was going to be a positive correlation between right-leaning ideology and this technocratic measure, because we thought, right-leaning folks might be more likely to want to pursue economic development and less likely to pursue redistributive policies. But I think, the perfect example of it running in the other direction is just this neoliberal tendency of people like Barack Obama and people like Pete. And so I think it just ends up cutting in a lot of different ways. And I'm not sure that it reflects necessarily moderation, although maybe that is what it is. Maybe like this third way moderate neoliberal sensibility is actually exactly.
I think my concern would be that it's conditional on being a Democratic Party mayor or city manager. The technocratic people tend to be in the more moderate side of the Democratic Party.
And that's almost certainly true. So we don't, yes, that is very true. We don't see the very progressive folks. And it's interesting because it's not that progressives aren't necessarily good managers, but it's interesting because their goals are just often less quantifiable. And so, some of the folks that we spoke to who clearly had a more left-leaning agenda, it's not that they don't have clear goals, it's that they sort of refuse to say, yes, we have exactly this number with exactly this timeline. It's just that they have sort of a more inclusive and participatory view of how they're going to achieve their goals. So I think you're right. So in that case, we can't completely rule out the idea that it's an ideology story, even after adjusting for ideology. Let me think about that.
I'm actually also mindful of the fact that we are right at 1:15.
Well, then it's a great question for future research. Perfect.
So I actually will bookmark this, although I welcome you to stick around after the conclusion of this. If anyone wants to stay, please feel free to do so. But we should pause here to let people who need to go. And I just want to thank again, Julia, for joining us. This is a really interesting paper, and we're very excited to see the book that this is a part of. So thank you again.
Oh, thank you so much, Maya, and thank you for the great questions. I really appreciate it.